Please take your seats. Mark is going to read the passage to us.
The passage is from the very beginning of the Bibles in front of you, and it will probably appear on the screen as well. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 3. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures. Let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the water teems and that moves about in it, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the water in the seas and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw that all that he had made, and it was very good. There was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done.
Great, thank you very much, Margaret, for reading that. Let me just pull this up here. As many of you know, oh, that's not helpful. We're going through a series at the moment of dealing with some difficult questions. And every week we're giving you the opportunity to text your questions in during the course of the sermon so that we can then spend 10 minutes doing a Q&A on that afterwards. So there won't be a hymn between me finishing and then doing the Q&A this morning. So if you want to text in the question, you need to do it while we're going. There won't be another opportunity to do that. Further on during the week, you can, if you're a Twitter user, you can use the send it to the above bar Twitter account using the ABC Q&A hashtag, and I'll be keeping an eye on that during the week. So a big question: why do we need God when we've got science? There's a number of notable scientists in Western society at the moment who say you absolutely don't. This guy, Douglas Adams, is not a scientist. He was a fiction writer, but he was a big fan of science, a friend of Richard Dawkins. He says, isn't it enough to see that a garden is beautiful without having to believe that there are fairies at the bottom of it? Can't we just enjoy the world as it is? Can't we just enjoy the magnificence of the galaxies and the extraordinary complexity of subatomic particles without trying to imagine that there's some supernatural entity behind it, which he dismisses as fairies at the bottom of the garden? Richard Dawkins, in his famous book, The God Delusion, says, we are all atheists about most of the gods that humanity has ever believed in. Some of us just go one God further, because science has dispensed with the need for believing in any of these gods. We Western people, we have dismissed the superstition of believing in many, many gods. Well, he says, let's just dismiss the superstition of believing in one creator God. He says, I think a case can be made that faith is one of the world's great evils, comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate. Faith, being belief that isn't based on evidence, is the principal vice of any religion. We do not need religion. We do not need the idea of God for people to be scared by, to keep them in line, so that they behave properly within society. He says we don't need any of that. We don't need to invent some great cosmic father figure in order to make sense of the world we live in. Science can do all of that. Science can tell us who we are, why we're here, what life is about. And faith and religion are deeply destructive forces in the world. Well, of course, religion can be a destructive force in the world. We've seen that plenty of times. But he says that to bring children up as Christians or with any faith is to run the risk of turning them into jihadis. Well, that's quite an extreme thing to say. What he's basically saying is that science is the way to truth. And he's not the only one to say it. Using Richard Dawkins quite a lot in quotes this morning because he's so well known. Probably all of you have come across Richard Dawkins on television at some point or other, talking about some of his beliefs, or in the newspapers or on Twitter, where he's particularly outspoken. But he's far from alone. There are many scientists out there who say science is how we find out what truth is. And any other way, faith, which is not, he says in that previous quote, it's not just based on a lack of evidence, it's faith despite evidence to the contrary, is what he's suggesting. The faith and religion, the idea of God, takes you in the wrong direction altogether. That is not the way to truth. Here's Stephen Hawking. He says, before we understand science, it is natural to believe that God created the universe. But now, science offers a more convincing explanation. We can do away with all these creation stories, the idea that God is behind anything. Science explains everything. Dawkins again. Scientists, he says, are the specialists in discovering what is true about the world and the universe. That is quite an extraordinary claim. quite a far-reaching claim that if you're from any non-scientific discipline, if you've studied music or English or languages, sorry, you're a second-class citizen, because scientists, and we'll include mathematicians as well, scientists are the specialists in discovering what is true. So if you want to know what is really true, you go to science, not to somewhere else. This little quote comes from an open letter he wrote to his daughter Juliet in the book A Devil's Chaplain a few years ago now. His daughter was about 10 at the time, I think. He'd been through a divorce. His first wife was Catholic, and he really objected to the way that his daughter was being brought up, in his view, to be brainwashed into Catholicism. So he wrote her this letter, and this is a little extract of it. He says, next time somebody tells you something that sounds important, think to yourself, is this the kind of thing that people probably know because of evidence, or is it the kind of thing that people only believe because of tradition, authority, or revelation? And next time somebody tells you that something is true, why not say to them, what kind of evidence is there for that? And if they can't give you a good answer, I hope you'll think very carefully before you believe a word they say. The implication there clearly is that religion is all about tradition and revelation and bad reasons for believing in things. The only good reason for believing in anything is evidence. But we need to ask the question, is it actually scientific to only trust science? He says science is the way to truth. Science is the only basis on which you can really know anything for sure. Is that actually a scientific statement? Because if it is, we ought to be able to do a series of experiments in a lab to prove that science is the only way to do science, or at least we ought to be able to do some theoretical physics or theoretical maths in order to be able to prove that. But you can't, because the statement or the idea that only science is the way to truth is not a scientific statement, that's a philosophical statement. That's a statement of faith. That's saying, I believe that science is the way to truth, but you can't prove that. There is no way that you can prove that you need proof. There's no way that you can have evidence, empirical evidence, experimental evidence, that evidence is the only way to know anything. In Dawkins' dismissive quote, people believing things because of tradition or revelation, ask them what evidence there is. Have you got evidence that you need evidence for everything you believe? And if you had evidence that you need evidence, do you have evidence for that evidence? You go all the way back. It's a never-ending sequence. You need evidence for the evidence for the evidence for the evidence. It's a philosophical assumption. It's a statement of faith. Science is grounded in faith. It is not based on what actually are scientific principles. But those statements of Dawkins and others like him completely ignore that. Science is the only way to truth. Nonsense. Science is a way of discovering what is true, of some things that are true about the world and the universe. But not everything, not even whether science is a reasonable discipline. I'll give you another quote from Douglas Adams that I particularly enjoy. He says, it is a mistake to think you can solve any major problems just with potatoes. Yes, that's absolutely true. I'd like to rephrase that slightly. It is a mistake to think you can solve any major problems just with science. We may be able to solve holes in the ozone layer with science, but we can't solve the problem of why we destroy our planet and create environmental problems in the first place, because that's not a scientific question, that's a moral question, an ethical question. We may be able to find a permanent cure for the AIDS epidemic around the world, but science will never address the problem of promiscuity and why a disease like this spreads through promiscuous sexual relationships in the first place. And of course, it spreads in other ways as well. But it doesn't deal with the problem of human beings and our fallibility and our tendencies towards selfishness and to indulge ourselves. You can't solve any major problems just with science. So Richard Swinburne, Oxford philosopher, he says, I am not postulating, I'm not suggesting the idea of a God of the gaps that merely explains the things that science hasn't yet explained. He wants to go much more fundamentally. He says, I am postulating a God to explain why science explains, because science can't explain that on its own terms. I am postulating a God to explain why science explains. I do not deny that science explains, but I postulate God to explain why science explains. As Einstein said, the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is its comprehensibility. Why do we understand any of it at all? So there are some gaps in our knowledge, and we've often said, oh, here's something we don't understand, that must be God, and then science comes along and fills in that gap and gives us an explanation for it. And Dawkins and others say that science is closing more and more of the gaps, that we'll understand more and more things from science, so that there'll be nothing left to explain. But actually, there are some gaps that we will never close, because ultimately they are not scientific questions. Let me whistle through a few very quickly. Firstly, why is the universe fine-tuned for life? If you look at physics, which is my background, you'll find that there are an extraordinary number of extremely fine balances in the way that the universe is set that make it possible for things to exist at all and for life to exist in particular. A number of things like the precise position of the Earth relative to the Sun and the relative size of the Sun and the Earth mean that we have exactly the right conditions on Earth to make life possible. If we were a little bit closer, we would be too hot and we would all burn up. If we were a little bit further away, we would be too cold and life would never start in the first place. We're in what scientists call the Goldilocks Zone, not too hot, not too cold. It's just right. But what about this one? In the nucleus of an atom, there are a couple of significant forces at work. One is called the strong force, one is called the weak force. The weak force has to be the value that it is to 1 in 10 to the power of 100. Now, if you don't have a maths background, you don't even know what I mean at this point. That's 1 in 10 followed by 100 zeros. That's an extremely tiny fraction. Because if you count all of the subatomic particles in the universe, you would find that there's only one with 80 zeros after them. So the fact that the weak force is balanced to 1 in 10 to the power of 100 is just extraordinary. How on earth has it come to be so fine-tuned? Martin Rees, who's the Astronomer Royal, says, he wrote a book called Just Six Numbers, looking at some of these very fine balances. And at the end, he said there's only two ways to understand these balances. One is what he calls providence, because he doesn't want to quite use the word God. And the alternative, he says, is that there are multiple universes, and we just happen to live in one that works. And there are lots of universes that are dead, lots of universes that disappear instantly, and so on. We just are lucky. We just live in the universe that works. Here we are. Ta-da! No big surprise. He says, I don't want to go down, I can't remember his precise phrase, he doesn't want to accept the idea of providence or of God. Therefore, he says he has to believe in the idea of multiple universes. At least he's honest about why he goes down that route. Here's Fred Hoyle, great British astronomer. I had the pleasure of hearing him lecture once. It was very entertaining. But he said, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. Hoyle described himself as an atheist, but he came to the conclusion that this is just, how do you understand this? How can you get your head around this? There are no blind forces here. Interesting conclusion to draw. So we could talk about why is the universe fine-tuned? We could talk about that at great length. I think that's an in-principle problem for science to ever explain. We may be able to understand the fine-tuning, but why is it there? That's a different kind of question. Why is the universe here at all? The universe is of such an improbable place. Why is it here? Here's Lawrence Krauss, who's a very outspoken physicist, atheist, and he author of a book called The Universe from Nothing. He says the Higgs boson, well, people have often called the God particle that was discovered a little while ago, the Higgs boson brings science closer to dispensing with the need for any supernatural shenanigans all the way back to the beginning of the universe. If we could, with the Higgs boson, the God particle, we can explain everything. No. We may be able to understand a little bit more about the origins of the universe, But it doesn't dispense with supernatural shenanigans, because it doesn't answer the question, why is the universe here? In a very reflective essay that Stephen Hawking wrote called Black Holes and Baby Universes, he said, although science may solve the problem of how the universe began, it cannot answer the question, why does the universe bother to exist? And then very honestly, he says, I don't know the answer to that. As time has gone on, Hawking has been more and more explicit about his atheist convictions. But in this very reflective essay, he recognized that science will never be able to answer the question, why is the universe here? Because the why questions are not scientific questions, ultimately. Does the universe just pop out of nothing for no reason at all, or is there something behind it? And even if it does just pop out of nothing, why are the laws of physics as they are to allow that to happen? Science can never answer those kinds of questions. Here's another one. Why does life exist? There isn't a single scientist who has a good answer to that question. However much scientists reckon they can explain the development of life, and there are arguments about that, of course, that they can't deal with the question of why does life exist in the first place. Here's Francis Crick, one of the discoverers of the structure of DNA, again, outspoken atheist. He says, the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to be satisfied to get it going. Now, he goes on to say, but we'll figure this out, because he had that kind of confidence in science. But actually, he recognizes that life is so improbable. Why is it here at all? How does anything get going? Nobody has a clue. And then what about this question? Who are we as human beings? Are we simply highly evolved apes? You know, we share 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees. Does that mean that we're just slightly more sophisticated than the DNA, than a chimpanzee? Well, we share 50% of our DNA with bananas, but I don't see people trying to... I possibly share more than 50% of my DNA with bananas. But people don't suggest that there's something intrinsically united about us and bananas. And yet, because chimpanzees are so like us in some ways, you know, they're intelligent apes, they behave in sociable ways and so on. But are we just apes that have developed language and wear clothes and have sophisticated tools? Or are we biological machines? As Richard Dawkins says, we are machines built by DNA whose purpose is to make more copies of the same DNA. That is exactly what we are here for. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for living. The book I quoted earlier, A Devil's Chaplain, he talks about going for a drive with his daughter in the countryside. They saw some wildflowers, and he said, "What are the wildflowers for, Juliet?" And she said, "To make the world look nice and to help the bees make honey for us." And what Dawkins says in his book is, "I was very touched and sorry I had to tell her it wasn't true." Because flowers are not there to make the world look nice. Flowers are not there to help the bees. Flowers' only purpose for existing is to pass on their DNA. That's mine too, according to Dawkins. So I've just about outlived my usefulness at a biological level. My youngest is 12. I probably need to look after him for a little bit longer, though if I didn't, he'd find a way of surviving. He's that kind of character. But you know, give us another few years, and apart from financially, they're not going to. Fat lot of good that will do them. But they won't need any more help from me. I've done my duty. I've passed on my DNA. That's it. I'm biologically redundant. And of course, that raises all kinds of questions about life, doesn't it? If I was to lose my rationality, does that what value do I have as a human being anymore? Is it not better just to turn off the switch, or give me a lethal injection? All sorts of big questions about that. But we can't answer what does it mean to be a human being. We can't answer who we really are as human beings at a scientific level, because understanding our DNA does not explain everything about us. I took Charlie yesterday to an open day at Middlesex University, one of a number of open days we're going to. He wants to study music. As concerned parents, we say, do something sensible. But actually, what is it about human beings? We have this urge to produce music and art and do these kinds of things. Life is not just about pragmatism, is it? Life is not only about survival and passing on our DNA. Life is also about music and beauty and relationships. And all of those things are not open to science. Some of you will know the cartoon XKCD. I love this one. My normal approach is useless here, because how do you do science about love? You can do science about chemical reactions when you see somebody that you're attracted to. You can do science about reproduction, but you cannot explain a relationship at a scientific level. So science can't explain some of these big things, and never will. It's not just that there are gaps that can be closed. These are questions that are not scientific questions. They are questions that have to be answered from another realm of knowledge altogether. And my conviction as a Christian, the conviction of many of us here, is that what the Bible gives us is God's answer to these kinds of questions. Why does the universe exist? Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created. The universe exists because there is a creator God who in his wisdom and generosity and magnificence and creativity has created a stunningly beautiful and complex universe. And we are in it. We are part of it. We are God's creation. Why does the universe exist? Because God created. Why did life start? Because God made it. Who are we as human beings? We are created by God. So Genesis 1 to 3, hugely important chapters of the Bible. And I know there's a lot of controversy over the ways that we understand Genesis 1 to 3 and beyond. I'm not getting into that at this point this morning. But what we are very clear about, whatever perspective on those early chapters of Genesis you come from as a Christian, what we do all agree on is the theology here. So in the beginning, God created. The entire space-time framework is contingent on God's creative activity. God is the creator of everything. Not just of everything that you see, but of all of the stuff that you don't see as well. And even space and time itself, God brought those into being. Genesis 1 makes clear that the world reflects its creator. Did you notice as we went through Genesis 1, as Margaret read that just now, how many times it says, and God saw that it was good, and God saw that it was good. And not only that, God kept saying, let there be. So it is God's activity that brings things into existence. And he essentially commands them to behave. He commands them to do what they do. The lights in the sky, I love the way that Genesis just calls them lights rather than the sun and moon, because it was a culture where people worship the sun and moon. So these are just lights that God has stuck up. But God has effectively commanded them to behave in a certain way, to mark out times and seasons and days. We get our structure of life because God has created an orderly universe. It's a beautiful universe. It's a diverse, utterly creative universe. All of that reflects God as the creator of it all. There's a lot more we could say about this passage, but supremely in Genesis chapter 1, the climax of the passage towards the end of the chapter, in verse 26 and 27, God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and over all the wild animals and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. And then he gives human beings instructions. Human beings are the pinnacle of God's creation because we uniquely, in all of the animal kingdom, however much of what percentage of our DNA we share with bananas and chimpanzees, human beings uniquely have the image of God within us. We are like God. We are God's image on earth. We represent God. We have some of God's capacities on a very tiny scale. We are creative and orderly and rational and relational. And we have a capacity to know God. God has made us for a relationship with him. That becomes clearer in chapter 2. But when you get to chapter 3, you discover another very important dimension of human beings, and that is that we are rebels against God. We haven't got time to look at that now, but in chapter 3, we see the account of human beings first turning their back on God, first lives. And we are cast out of the paradise that God put the first human beings into, and we are under God's judgment. And every one of us here this morning is an inheritor of that fallen human nature, that rebellious human nature. We are all rebels against God. We are all out of relationship, have been put out of relationship with God, and therefore are under God's judgment. If God created us, he has the right to expect our allegiance and our love, and yet we've turned our back on him. The rest of the Bible is the unfolding story of how God deals with that problem, ultimately taking us to the New Testament and the Gospels, where we see that God has made it possible for us human beings made in his image, who've rebelled against him, to be put right with him, to be reconciled to him. And many of us here this morning would say that is our experience. We know who we are created in the image of God. But even more than that, we know who we are as human beings because we are God's children, adopted into his family because of the death and resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ. And that perspective on humans as being utterly wonderful because we're created in God's image, and utterly terrible because we're rebels against God. Science has no explanation for that. Not a good one. But the Bible does. And the Bible does more than that. It tells us how we can come to know God for ourselves. I'll stop there. We'll take some questions. John's going to take us through that. Hopefully there's been a few texted in.
Am I live? Yes. Okay, just to be clear, you're going to answer them, yeah? Yeah.
That's not my understanding.
Okay. Thank you, Tony, very much for all that you shared this morning. There are lots of questions coming in. Let me just give you a few of them. In the past, there were world-leading scientists like Faraday and Pascal who were Christians. Are there any today, as all the quotes you've used are from scientists who are atheists?
Yes, there are lots of Christian scientists around. There was a study done in 1905 of the 1,000 leading scientists in the United States, and I can't remember the precise figure off the top of my head, but it was a significant proportion. And then in the 1990s, there were some American atheist scientists who said, we're winning the war. You know, science is conquering religion, and the number of Christian scientists scientists who are Christians is diminishing all the time. So another survey was done, and it was only 0.5% less over 90 odd years. So Francis Collins, who headed up the Human Genome Project for years, he's a very committed Christian who says that he came to believe in God because of what he saw in science. Ian Prance used to be the director of Kew Gardens, the leading botanist in the world. Brilliant, committed scientist. I've known, and still do know, a number of very significant scientists who are committed Christians. All sorts of fields, biological, physical, mathematical, every field there are Christians. But there are scientists who are not Christians too. And at the moment, they're the vocal ones. And they're the ones who are catching the public attention. People like Dawkins and Hawking are the ones that people pay attention to.
Thank you, Tony. Just going back to the beginning of your talk, couldn't your fine-tuning argument be explained by probability? Couldn't our existence be just by chance? Why must you invent a God to answer that question?
The probabilities are so tiny. That's why I gave you the weak force. I could have given you a whole lot more, but the weak force is particularly interesting. 1 in 10 to the power of 100. Well, that's an extraordinarily minute accuracy, and therefore an extraordinarily minute probability of that force being exactly the right size just by chance. So if you accept the common scientific figure for the age of the universe, about 14 billion years, there are only 10 to the power 17 seconds, one with 17 zeros after, since the beginning of the universe. And this is 1 in 10 to the power of 100. So it's just literally astronomically greater or smaller probability. And it's not just the weak force. It's the the rate of expansion of the universe versus the size of the gravitational constant, which is tending to pull things back in. It's the amount of dark matter that there is in the universe. It's the energy levels in carbon and oxygen that make life possible, and on and on and on. And you'd need to put all of these together and look at these tiny probabilities for all of them. Well, you would need an infinite number of universes in order to have one in which we were lucky enough to exist.
So it's really the probabilistic argument that leads people to the multiverse. You have to have faith in a multiverse.
Yes. The probabilities are so small, you either have to say there's something behind this, there's a God behind this of some sort. And of course, it doesn't necessarily take you to a Christian God. You need the Bible to get you to there. But the idea that there is a creator of some sort behind it, or you have to say, if you don't want to accept the idea of a God, then there have to have been many, 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 many universes, all with slightly different starting conditions in order to make one possible.
Is there any evidence for multiple universes?
None whatsoever.
Okay. So it takes faith.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it is absolutely a faith statement. That there is, I mean, the nature of the universe is it's a closed system. So you can't possibly have any evidence of a second universe. So we don't know they're not there, but it's a massive leap of faith to bring in the idea of vast numbers of universes in order to make us possible. It's a much easier thing to believe that God is the creator of it. And even if we did discover that there are multiple universes, the question still remains, why do any of them exist? What brings any of them into existence? Where does the energy that makes it possible in the first place come from? You still haven't answered the question of why. You just have to answer the question why more times. Doesn't help anything.
Probably just one more question. This is a little bit of a tricky one, I think, from a different perspective, perhaps. Wasn't the Genesis story written as a style of writing akin to poetry rather than written literally like the New Testament Gospels? Therefore, isn't it more important to focus on the description of God's intent in the creation of the world as opposed to the details of the physical processes behind it? Also, the term day used in the Hebrew is not specific to 24 hours, but just to, quotes, a period of time. I know that's massive, but do you want to just say anything?
Yeah, that is massive. There are a number of different ways of real Bible-believing Christians with a deep love for the Bible and a desire to understand it as well as they can. They've looked at this text and have come to different conclusions about how we should understand that. And the fact that that has happened shows that it's not a straightforward thing to work out precisely how we should understand it. The language that's used in the Hebrew it's in a class of its own, really. It's not poetry, but it's not ordinary prose like the rest of the Hebrew Old Testament either. It is highly structured. It has some poetic features, but it's not quite reaching Hebrew poetry. Extraordinarily structured in all sorts of ways, and there are question marks over how many of the words should actually be translated, including the word that's used, made and created. There are arguments even over how those words should be properly understood because they both have a very wide range of meanings. So you put all that together and you've got people who say what Genesis chapter 1 says is about 7 literal 24-hour periods, right the way through to people who say this is not talking about timescales at all. As this question is asking, it's a literary device, it's a literary structure which is helping people to understand their place in the universe and that God is behind it, that He's created a structured universe, but that it's not talking about timescales. And then you've got all sorts of possibilities in between. And yes, that's a complex question that we don't really have time to go any further in. The fact that there are multiple views, though, means that we do have to have it seems to me, have a degree of humility in whatever position we adopt and say, and bear with those who look at it differently. Because it's not about not accepting what the Bible says, it's about how do we understand it correctly. Yeah. And we go to that question, what genre is this, what kind of writing is this, how should we understand it? We do that with every other bit of the Bible. It's usually easier in other parts of the Bible.
Tony, thank you very much. There are one or two other questions, but we're done on time. Thank you very much for answering our questions. I think we should express our thanks to Tony. It takes a bit of guts to do that.
Colossians chapter 1 says, "For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created for him, through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." Let's stand and say that Jesus is Lord.